The first snow fell in Oslo on a day that should have been warm. Ira Halvorsen stood at the edge of the city's bustling harbor, her breath visible in the icy air despite the calendar insisting it was late spring. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun struggled to pierce through a thick blanket of gray clouds. The snowflakes were fat and heavy, clinging to her dark hair and the shoulders of her wool coat. It was unnatural, this cold, and yet no one around her seemed to notice. Or perhaps they didn't want to. Ira was used to being the odd one out. As a folklorist specializing in Norse mythology, she spent her days buried in ancient texts and crumbling runestones, piecing together stories that most people dismissed as fairy tales. But this was different. The snow wasn't just snow. It carried a weight, a silence that felt almost alive. It whispered something she couldn't quite understand, something that made the back of her neck prickle. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her brother, Magnus. ***, Ira, we need to talk. It's urgent. ***, she frowned. Magnus wasn't the type to use words like urgent. He was a climate scientist, methodical and precise, the kind of person who measured his words as carefully as he measured data. If he was reaching out to her, something was wrong. She typed a quick reply. ***, what's going on? ***, the response came almost immediately. ***, not over text. Can you come to the lab? Ira hesitated. She and Magnus hadn't spoken in months, not since their last argument about her obsession with myths and his cold-hearted reliance on data. But the snow, the cold, the whisper in the wind, it all felt connected somehow. She couldn't ignore it. Fine, she muttered to herself, shoving her phone back into her pocket. But this better be good. The lab was on the outskirts of the city, a sleek modern building that felt out of place against the backdrop of snow-covered hills. Ira stepped inside, shaking the snow from her coat, and was immediately struck by the hum of activity. Scientists moved between workstations, their faces tense, their voices low. Magnus was waiting for her by the door. He looked older than she remembered, his sandy hair streaked with gray, his face lined with worry. "Ira," he said, his voice tight. "Thanks for coming. What's going on?" she asked, cutting straight to the point. He led her to a bank of monitors, each displaying graphs and maps that meant nothing to her. "We've been tracking some anomalies," he began. "Global temperatures are dropping at an unprecedented rate, but the polar ice caps, they're melting. It doesn't make sense." "None of it makes sense." Ira crossed her arms. "And you called me because?" Magnus hesitated, then pulled a small, weathered stone from his pocket. It was a runestone, its surface etched with ancient symbols that Ira recognized immediately. "This was delivered to the lab this morning," he said. "No return address, no note." Just this, Ira's breath caught. The runestone was identical to the ones she'd studied for years, but there was something different about it. The symbols seemed to shimmer faintly, as if alive. "Do you know what it says?" Magnus asked. She nodded slowly. "It's a prophecy. About Fimbulwinter." "Fimbulwinter? The 3-year winter that precedes Ragnarok," she explained. "According to the myths, it's a time of endless cold, when brother turns against brother and the world descends into chaos." Magnus frowned. "You're saying this myth is coming true." "I don't know," Ira admitted. "But this runestone, it's not just a relic. It's a warning." As if on cue, the runestone began to glow, a faint, eerie light that pulsed in time with the hum of the lab's machines. Ira felt a sudden rush of dizziness, her vision blurring as images flooded her mind. A world buried in snow, the sun swallowed by darkness, a horn echoing across a frozen wasteland. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the vision ended. Ira stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a desk. "Ira," Magnus's voice was sharp with concern. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her hands were trembling. "We need to find out where this runestone came from. And we need to do it fast." Magnus hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But Ira, if this is real, if the myths are real, what does that mean for us?" She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "It means we're running out of time." Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and relentless. Somewhere, deep in the heart of the storm, a raven watched, its eyes gleaming with a light that was not of this world. The whisper of winter had begun, and it would not be ignored. The snowstorm had worsened by the time Ira and Magnus left the lab. The streets of Oslo were eerily quiet, the usual hum of city life muffled by the thick blanket of snow. Ira clutched the runestone tightly in her hand, its faint glow a constant reminder of the urgency of their mission. Magnus walked beside her, his face set in a grim expression, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. "Where do we even start?" Magnus asked, breaking the silence. Ira glanced at the runestone, the ancient symbols shimmering faintly. According to the myths, Fimbulwinter is heralded by 3 roosters crowing in different realms. But this runestone, it mentions a temple hidden beneath the ice, a place where the gods once made their pacts with humanity. Magnus frowned. "A temple? You mean like a physical place?" "Yes," Ira replied. "If we can find it, we might be able to uncover more about the prophecy and how to stop it." Magnus shook his head. "This is insane. We're chasing fairy tales while the world is literally freezing." "And yet," Ira said, holding up the runestone, "this fairy tale just showed me a vision of the end of the world. So unless you have a better idea, I suggest we follow the clues." Magnus sighed but didn't argue. He knew she was right. Their first stop was the university library, a sprawling building filled with ancient texts and artifacts. Ira led the way to the restricted section, where the oldest and most fragile manuscripts were kept. She pulled out a dusty tome, its pages yellowed with age, and began to flip through it. "Here," she said, pointing to a faded illustration of a temple carved into a glacier. "This matches the description on the runestone. It's called the Temple of the Pact, a place where the gods and mortals once met to maintain the balance of the world." Magnus leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the illustration. "And where is this temple supposed to be?" Ira traced a finger along the map beside the illustration. "Somewhere in the northern mountains. But the exact location has been lost for centuries." "Great," Magnus muttered. "So we're looking for a needle in a frozen haystack." Ira ignored his sarcasm and pulled out her phone, typing quickly. "There's an old village in the north, near the mountains. The locals still tell stories about the temple. If anyone knows where it is, it's them." Magnus raised an eyebrow. "And you think they'll just tell us?" "We don't have a choice," Ira said, closing the book with a decisive thud. "We have to try." The journey to the village was long and arduous. The snowstorm had grounded all flights, so they were forced to take a train, then a bus, and finally a snowmobile to reach their destination. By the time they arrived, both Ira and Magnus were exhausted, their faces red from the biting cold. The village was small and isolated, a cluster of wooden houses nestled in a valley surrounded by towering mountains. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, and the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath their boots as they made their way to the village square. An elderly woman stood by a well, her face lined with age but her eyes sharp and alert. She watched them approach with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "You're not from around here," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen much in her lifetime. "No," Ira admitted. "We're looking for the Temple of the Pact." "Do you know where it is?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "Why do you seek the temple?" Ira hesitated, then held up the runestone. "Because this says the end of the world is coming, and the temple might be the only way to stop it." The woman studied the runestone for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The temple is real, but it is not a place for the faint of heart. Many have sought it, few have returned. We don't have a choice," Magnus said, his voice firm. "We have to try." The woman sighed, then pointed to the tallest mountain in the distance. "The temple lies beneath the glacier there. But be warned, the path is treacherous, and the temple itself is guarded by ancient magic. If you are not worthy, it will destroy you." Ira and Magnus exchanged a glance, then nodded. "Thank you," Ira said. The woman's expression softened. "May the gods watch over you." The climb to the glacier was even more difficult than they had anticipated. The snow was deep, the wind relentless, and the cold seeped into their bones no matter how many layers they wore. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that time was running out. As they neared the glacier, the runestone began to glow brighter, its light guiding them through the blinding snow. Finally, they reached a massive ice wall, its surface smooth and unbroken. "This is it," Ira said, her voice barely above a whisper. Magnus frowned. But how do we get in? Ira held up the runestone, and as if in response, the ice began to crack and shift, revealing a hidden entrance. The air inside was cold and still, the walls lined with ancient carvings that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. "This is it," Ira said again, her voice filled with awe. "The Temple of the Pact." But as they stepped inside, they realized they were not alone. Shadows moved in the corners of the temple, and the air grew heavy with a sense of foreboding. "We're being watched," Magnus whispered. Ira nodded, her grip tightening on the runestone. "Stay close. And whatever happens, don't let go of this." The temple was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness, its walls covered in intricate carvings that told the story of the gods and their pacts with humanity. But as they ventured deeper, the carvings began to change, depicting scenes of chaos and destruction. And then they saw it. A massive altar at the center of the temple, its surface covered in runes that matched those on the runestone. But standing before the altar was a figure, cloaked in shadows, their presence radiating an aura of malevolence. "Who are you?" Ira demanded, her voice echoing through the temple. The figure turned, revealing a face that was both familiar and alien. Their eyes glowed with a cold, unnatural light, and their smile was filled with malice. "I am the guardian of this place," the figure said, their voice a chilling whisper. "And you are not welcome here." Ira and Magnus exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding. They had found the temple, but they were far from safe. The guardian stepped forward, their presence filling the temple with an oppressive weight. "Leave now or face the consequences." Ira tightened her grip on the runestone, her mind racing. They had come too far to turn back now. "We're not leaving," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Not until we find a way to stop Fimbulwinter." The guardian's smile widened, their eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. "Then you will die." And with that, the temple erupted into chaos. The temple trembled as the guardian stepped forward, their presence filling the vast chamber with an oppressive weight. The air grew colder, the faint light from the runes on the walls flickering like dying embers. Ira clutched the runestone tightly, its glow the only thing keeping the encroaching darkness at bay. Magnus stood beside her, his breath visible in the freezing air, his face pale but determined. "Leave now," the guardian repeated, their voice echoing with a power that seemed to reverberate through the very stone. "Or face the consequences." Ira's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand tall. "We're not leaving. We came here to stop Fimbulwinter, and we won't let you stand in our way." The guardian's smile widened, their glowing eyes narrowing with amusement. "Brave words, mortal. But bravery alone will not save you." With a wave of their hand, the guardian summoned a swirling vortex of ice and shadow, the tempest roaring to life and filling the chamber with a deafening howl. Ira and Magnus staggered back, shielding their faces from the biting wind. "What do we do?" Magnus shouted over the noise, his voice tinged with panic. Ira's mind raced. The runestone, it had guided them here, and it had opened the temple. Maybe it could help them now. She held it up, focusing on the ancient symbols etched into its surface. "Heimdall," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If you can hear me, we need your help." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the runestone flared to life, its light piercing through the darkness. The vortex faltered, the winds dying down as the guardian hissed in frustration. "You dare invoke the gods in this place?" they snarled. "You who have forgotten their names and turned your backs on their wisdom." "We haven't forgotten," Ira said, her voice growing stronger. "We're here to make things right. To honor the pacts our ancestors made with the gods." The guardian hesitated, their glowing eyes narrowing as they studied her. "Prove it." Before Ira could respond, the temple shifted around them. The walls seemed to dissolve, replaced by a vast, frozen landscape. The air was so cold it burned her lungs, and the ground beneath her feet was slick with ice. In the distance, she could see a massive tree, its branches bare and twisted, its roots sinking deep into the frozen earth. "Yggdrasil," Magnus murmured, his voice filled with awe. The guardian's voice echoed around them, disembodied and cold. "This is the world tree, the axis of the 9 realms. To prove your worth, you must face the trials of the gods. Fail and you will be lost forever." Ira exchanged a glance with Magnus. "Trials? What kind of trials?" Before he could answer, the ground beneath them cracked, and they were plunged into darkness. When Ira opened her eyes, she was no longer in the frozen landscape. She stood in a lush green forest, the air warm and filled with the scent of blooming flowers. Birds sang in the trees, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was a stark contrast to the icy temple, and for a moment, Ira wondered if she had been transported to another realm entirely. "Magnus," she called, her voice echoing through the trees. There was no response. She was alone. As she walked through the forest, she began to notice strange details. The trees were too tall, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways that seemed unnatural. The birds' songs were too melodic, their voices almost human. And the flowers, they were beautiful, but their colors were too vivid, their petals shimmering with an otherworldly light. "Welcome, Ira Halvorsen," a voice said, soft and melodic. Ira turned to see a woman standing before her. She was tall and elegant, her hair the color of sunlight, her eyes a deep forest green. She wore a gown woven from leaves and flowers, and her presence radiated a warmth that made Ira feel both comforted and uneasy. "Who are you?" Ira asked, her voice trembling. The woman smiled. "I am Idun, keeper of the golden apples. You stand in my realm, the realm of life and renewal." Ira's breath caught. "Idun, the goddess of youth and immortality." "Why am I here?" "To face your trial," Idun replied. "To prove that you are worthy of the gods' trust." Before Ira could respond, the forest around her began to change. The trees withered, their leaves turning brown and falling to the ground. The flowers wilted, their vibrant colors fading to gray. The birds' songs turned to cries of despair, and the warm breeze became a cold, biting wind. "What's happening?" Ira asked, her voice filled with panic. "The balance of the world is breaking," Idun said, her voice tinged with sadness. "Fimbulwinter is coming, and with it, the end of all things. To restore the balance, you must make a choice." "What choice?" Idun held out her hand, revealing a single golden apple. It glowed with a soft, warm light, its surface smooth and perfect. "This apple holds the power to restore life, to heal the world. But it comes at a cost. To take it, you must give something of equal value." Ira's heart sank. "What do I have to give?" Idun's gaze was steady, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resolve. "Your memories. The moments that define you, the people you love. To save the world, you must forget them." Ira's breath caught. Her memories, her grandmother's stories, her childhood with Magnus, her life's work as a folklorist. They were a part of her, the foundation of who she was. I can't," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Then the world will perish," Idun said, her voice gentle but firm. "The choice is yours." Ira stared at the apple, her mind racing. She thought of Magnus, of the bond they had only just begun to rebuild. She thought of her grandmother, who had believed in the myths when no one else did. She thought of the world, of the people who would suffer if Fimbulwinter was not stopped. With a trembling hand, she reached for the apple. When Ira opened her eyes, she was back in the temple, the runestone glowing brightly in her hand. Magnus stood beside her, his face pale and drawn, as if he too had faced a trial of his own. The guardian watched them, their expression unreadable. "You have passed the first trial," they said, their voice echoing through the chamber. "But the path ahead is fraught with danger. Are you prepared to face what comes next?" Ira nodded, her resolve hardening. "We have to be." The guardian's smile was faint, almost approving. "Then proceed. But know this, the trials will only grow harder. And the cost of failure is death." As the guardian stepped aside, revealing a passage deeper into the temple, Ira and Magnus exchanged a glance. They had come this far, but the hardest part was yet to come. The passage beyond the guardian led deeper into the temple, the air growing colder with every step. The walls were lined with ancient carvings that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light of the runestone. Ira clutched it tightly, its glow a steady beacon in the oppressive darkness. Magnus walked beside her, his face pale but determined, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Do you think the guardian was telling the truth?" Magnus asked, his voice low. "About the trials getting harder?" Ira nodded, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "We have to be ready for anything." The passage opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. At its center stood a massive stone altar, its surface covered in runes that pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. Above the altar hung a massive horn, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Jallarhorn, Ira whispered, her voice filled with awe. The horn that signals the beginning of Ragnarok. Magnus frowned. If that's here, does that mean? Before he could finish, the air around them shifted, and a figure materialized before the altar. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face obscured by a hooded cloak. In his hand, he held a staff topped with a glowing crystal, its light casting eerie shadows across the chamber. "Welcome, Ira Halvorson," the figure said, his voice deep and resonant. "I have been waiting for you." Ira's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Who are you?" The figure lowered his hood, revealing a face that was both familiar and alien. His eyes glowed with a cold, unnatural light, and his smile was filled with malice. "I am Loki," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "And you, my dear, have walked right into my trap." Ira's breath caught. Loki, the trickster god, the bringer of chaos. She had read the myths, studied his deeds, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of his presence. "What do you want?" Magnus demanded, stepping forward. Loki's smile widened. "What do I want? I want what I have always wanted, chaos. The world has grown stagnant, complacent. It needs a reset, a rebirth. And Fimbulwinter is the perfect catalyst." Ira's grip tightened on the runestone. "We won't let you destroy the world." Loki laughed, the sound echoing through the chamber. "You think you can stop me? You, a mere mortal, armed with nothing but a piece of stone. We're not alone," Ira said, her voice steady. "Heimdall is with us." As if on cue, the runestone flared to life, its light piercing through the darkness. The air around them shimmered, and a figure began to materialize beside Ira. He was tall and radiant, his armor gleaming with a light that seemed to come from within. His eyes were sharp and piercing, and his presence filled the chamber with a sense of calm authority. "Heimdall," Loki sneered. "I should have known you would interfere." "Your chaos ends here, Loki," Heimdall said, his voice firm. "The world will not fall to your schemes." Loki's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure hatred. "We'll see about that." With a wave of his staff, Loki summoned a wave of darkness that surged toward them. Heimdall raised his hand, and a barrier of light appeared, deflecting the attack. The chamber erupted into chaos as the two gods clashed, their powers shaking the very foundations of the temple. Ira and Magnus stumbled back, shielding their faces from the blinding light and deafening noise. "What do we do?" Magnus shouted over the noise. Ira's mind raced. The runestone, it was the key. She had to use it to awaken Heimdall fully, to give him the strength to defeat Loki. But the cost, she glanced at Magnus, her heart aching. The runestone required a sacrifice, and she was the only one who could make it. "Magnus," she said, her voice trembling, "I have to do this. It's the only way." Magnus's eyes widened. "No, there has to be another way." Ira shook her head. "There isn't. This is what I was meant to do." Before Magnus could protest, Ira stepped forward, holding the runestone aloft. The light from it grew brighter, filling the chamber with a blinding radiance. "Heimdall," she called, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I offer myself to you. Take my life and use it to protect the world." Heimdall turned to her, his expression filled with sorrow. "You are brave, Ira Halvorson. Braver than most." Loki laughed, the sound filled with malice. "Foolish girl. You think your sacrifice will make a difference?" Ira ignored him, focusing on the runestone. She could feel its power coursing through her, filling her with a sense of purpose. "Do it," she said, her voice firm. Heimdall nodded, and with a wave of his hand, the runestone's light enveloped her. She felt a surge of energy, a warmth that spread through her body, and then darkness. When Ira opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor of the temple, the runestone still clutched in her hand. The chamber was silent, the air still. "Ira," Magnus's voice was filled with concern. She sat up, her head spinning. What happened?" Heimdall stood before her, his expression filled with relief. "You did it, Ira. You stopped Loki." Ira looked around, her heart pounding. "Where is he?" "Gone," Heimdall said. "For now. But his influence remains. The world is not yet safe." Ira nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll keep fighting. We'll protect the world no matter what it takes." Heimdall smiled, his expression filled with pride. "You are truly worthy of your lineage, Ira Halvorson. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. Ira and Magnus stood at the entrance of the temple, the runestone still glowing faintly in her hand. "What now?" Magnus asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Ira took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. "Now we prepare. Fimbulwinter may have been delayed, but it's not over. We have to be ready for whatever comes next." Magnus nodded, his expression filled with determination. Together, Ira smiled, her heart filled with a sense of hope. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. But the battle was far from over. As they made their way down the mountain, the sun breaking through the clouds, Ira couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The world was still in danger, but they had faced the worst and survived. And as long as they stood together, they could face anything. The final scene showed a raven, perched on a branch overlooking the temple. Its eyes gleamed with intelligence, and as it took flight, its caw echoed through the mountains, a reminder that the gods were always watching. The world was safe for now, but the whispers of winter still lingered, a reminder that the balance of the world was fragile and the fight was far from over. And so, Ira and Magnus walked into the future, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, their bond stronger than ever and their resolve unshakable. The end.